For as long as complex societies have existed, they have relied on something abstract to bind them together. Not kings or armies, not laws or borders, but trust. Trust that a token today will still carry meaning tomorrow. Trust that effort will be rewarded later. Trust that the system remembers who contributed, who saved, who deferred consumption for the future. When that trust holds, empires expand with startling speed. When it erodes, they do not fall apart all at once. They thin, they hollow, they continue to function long after the logic that once sustained them has quietly disappeared. History shows this pattern with unnerving consistency. The dominant power of an era builds a system so efficient that others must participate in it to survive. Trade routes converge, standards unify. The currency of the center becomes the language of value everywhere else. For a time, this arrangement looks permanent. Stability reinforces confidence. Confidence attracts more participation. Participation deepens dependence, and dependence disguises fragility. Then, almost imperceptibly, the system changes character. What once measured value begins to manufacture it. What once disciplined behavior begins to excuse it. Productivity slows, but consumption does not. Obligations compound faster than real output. The system still appears strong because activity remains high, transactions continue, and wealth seems abundant. But the wealth is no longer circulating back into the structures that created it. It passes through, leaks outward, or evaporates into claims on a future that cannot fully arrive. No banners are burned. No capital is stormed. The transition unfolds inside balance sheets, settlement systems, and accounting conventions few people ever see. The outward symbols of power remain intact even as the underlying incentives invert. Savers are quietly penalized. Leverage is rewarded. Discipline is reframed as inefficiency. What was once considered temporary becomes structural. What was once unthinkable becomes necessary. At this stage, the system does not collapse. It persists. It grows more complex, more managed, more dependent on narratives to explain outcomes that no longer align with inputs. The center still issues the unit everyone uses, but fewer choose to store their future in it. Alternatives emerge not out of rebellion, but out of pragmatism. Not announced, not coordinated, not dramatic. Just adopted, transaction by transaction, contract by contract, reserve by reserve. Centuries of history suggest that this is how monetary dominance actually ends. Not with a crash that announces itself, but with a replacement that feels administrative, reasonable, even boring. By the time the change becomes obvious, the choice has already been made, and by the time it is named, it is no longer reversible. Collapse does not arrive in a single, violent instant. It creeps, first through subtle misalignments in the system's foundations, then through accelerating contradictions that no single actor can resolve. Economists and historians often describe this as a series of stages, each predictable once the dynamics are understood, yet nearly invisible to those living through them. A typical pattern begins with overextension. The system grows beyond its productive base, relying on promises, leverage, or credit to maintain appearances of vitality. This is followed by distortion, where monetary or fiscal policies begin to mask underlying weaknesses rather than address them. Debt accumulates, often in ways invisible to ordinary participants, creating obligations that compound faster than output or innovation can satisfy. Next comes the subtle erosion of productivity. Enterprises and institutions that once generated real value are now consumed by compliance, risk management, or rent-seeking. Effort is redirected from creation to circulation, and wealth moves through the system without replenishing it. The fourth stage is confidence fatigue. Signals that once inspired trust, audits, balance sheets, public institutions, begin to lose credibility. As participants detect the gap between appearance and reality, warnings emerge but are discounted, rationalized, or ignored. By the fifth stage, substitution begins. Actors who must preserve value start exploring alternatives. Reserves diversify. Contracts denominate differently. Influence shifts quietly to those offering reliability, not promises. The sixth stage is institutional denial, where formal structures continue to operate as if the system is intact, even while stress spreads. Risks that would have been intolerable in earlier phases become normalized, and the logic of incentives inverts. Prudence is penalized, and recklessness rewarded. Finally comes the acceleration phase, often misunderstood as collapse. In reality, the system is no longer collapsing, it has been replaced incrementally. Its outward form persists even as its function is transferred elsewhere. This is why history often surprises observers. The dominant system does not end with a bang, but fades from the center of global reliance, quietly ceded to alternatives that have grown sufficient to absorb the trust once concentrated in a single authority. Understanding these stages illuminates why financial dominance is less about power exercised and more about confidence maintained. When the incentives that once underwrote trust invert, collapse is no longer an event to prevent, it is a pattern to recognize. And once the stages have advanced far enough, reversal is not a matter of policy or intention, but of structural impossibility. The system's exit has already been written into its own dynamics. Consider the Roman Empire at its height, a network of cities, roads, and ports spanning 3 continents, its currency accepted from Londinium to Alexandria. Rome did not dominate through force alone. It dominated because its monetary and legal systems made trade predictable, credit reliable, and obligations enforceable. Taxes collected in coins could fund armies, infrastructure, and public works. Merchants and provinces prospered under the illusion of stability, confident that a denarius in their hand represented real value, recognized everywhere. For centuries, the machinery of Rome's economy turned smoothly, transferring wealth through its arteries with remarkable efficiency. Yet beneath this brilliance lay structural weaknesses. Rome's expansion required ever larger military expenditures. Conquests that once filled the treasury eventually slowed, forcing reliance on debt, inflation, and increasingly elaborate tax farming. Monetary distortion followed. Coinage was debased repeatedly, each adjustment slightly eroding trust in the currency while providing temporary relief to the state. At the same time, social expectations remained high. The elite consumed extravagantly, public spectacles required funding, and urban populations relied on subsidized grain. Productivity growth, however, lagged behind consumption. Labor was redirected from innovation and maintenance to extraction and administration. The economic engine appeared robust, but it was now running on deferred obligations and manufactured confidence. As wealth flowed through the empire, it rarely returned in ways that could sustain the system. Provinces sent tribute to Rome, and armies consumed resources locally, but investments in productive infrastructure declined. Rome's financial center accumulated claims, not productive capacity. This mismatch between real output and obligations sowed the seeds of systemic fragility. Citizens and administrators alike remained confident because outward appearances, roads, aqueducts, armies, persisted. Yet the stage was set for a slow, inexorable decline. By the 4th century, the stages of collapse were unmistakable in hindsight. Overextension had stretched Rome beyond sustainable limits. Monetary distortion had reduced the value of the denarius. Debt and obligations overwhelmed the treasury. Productivity had declined while consumption persisted. Confidence fatigue spread among elites and provincial administrators. Alternatives arose in the form of regional powers asserting autonomy, foreign mercenaries commanding loyalty, and local economies bypassing central control. Rome did not vanish overnight. It lingered, hollowed, and ultimately ceded dominance quietly, leaving behind an empire of memory and symbols rather than structural authority. The Roman example reveals a critical lesson. Dominance can persist even while the system is being hollowed from within. Wealth moves through, but no longer replenishes the structures that made it possible. Collapse is not a moment of chaos. It is a transfer of function, often invisible until long after the transition has begun. Centuries later, a different story played out on the banks of the Mississippi and along the Atlantic seaboard. The United States emerged as a dominant economic power in the 20th century, its currency becoming the global medium of exchange. its financial system the backbone of international trade. Confidence in the dollar was near universal. Nations accumulated reserves, companies priced contracts, and governments conducted diplomacy, all assuming the permanence of American monetary and institutional reliability. The prevailing narrative insisted that the combination of innovation, military power, and political stability made the system fundamentally resilient. This time is different, many believed. Yet beneath this certainty, familiar dynamics were quietly unfolding. Overextension occurred not through military conquest, but through financial commitments, wars abroad, social obligations at home, and an increasingly complex global financial network dependent on continuous American liquidity. Monetary policies, especially those expanding credit and managing interest rates, masked underlying strains rather than resolving them. Debt accumulation accelerated across private and public sectors, often with incentives that rewarded risk and deferred accountability. Productivity grew unevenly, while consumption soared. Economic growth increasingly relied on leverage, speculation, and complex financial instruments that few fully understood. Denial became pervasive. Analysts and policymakers noticed warning signs but reframed them as temporary or technical. Crises were declared containable, shocks manageable. Confidence remained high, even as systemic fragility deepened. Alternative arrangements, emerging currencies, regional trade agreements, digital settlements were dismissed or minimized, their growth slow yet persistent. History, however, was repeating itself. The stages of collapse were present, from overextension to substitution, even under new technological and institutional conditions. By the early 21st century, the lesson of "this time is different" had proven misleading. The system's outward form, the dollar, the central institutions, the global networks, remained dominant. But reliance on the center was increasingly voluntary, based on convenience, legal norms, and inertia rather than unassailable trust. Gradually, reserves diversified, contracts shifted, and structural authority was ceded incrementally to alternatives that had quietly matured. The familiar pattern of slow hollowing, masked confidence, and eventual replacement had re-emerged, proving that no innovation or narrative can suspend the laws of systemic incentives. Today, the echoes of history are visible in the modern global financial system. The dollar remains the primary medium of exchange, the unit in which commodities are priced, and the standard in which debts are denominated. Its dominance is reinforced by deep liquidity, legal frameworks, and established networks. Yet beneath the surface, structural forces, debt accumulation, incentive misalignments, and productivity constraints mirror patterns observed in every prior era of monetary transition. Debt, both public and private, has grown to levels that outpace real output growth. Incentives favor leverage over prudence. Institutions are rewarded for taking risks that enrich participants in the short term, while losses are often socialized or deferred. Productivity gains, once the engine of sustained growth, have become concentrated, uneven, and often disconnected from the broader economy. Monetary expansion maintains liquidity and stabilizes prices superficially, but it cannot fully substitute for the underlying value creation that once underwrote trust. Confidence is maintained less by fundamentals than by narratives, frameworks, and legal convention. What distinguishes the modern system is not its immunity to historical patterns, but its sophistication in masking them. Alternative systems, emerging currencies, regional agreements, digital reserves, are adopted incrementally, quietly, and often unnoticed outside specialist circles. Transaction by transaction, contract by contract, some reliance shifts away from the dollar. The center continues to function, issuing a currency recognized globally, while the functional dominance of that currency is gradually diluted. Systems fail not when intentions fail, but when the incentives that sustain them invert. And once those incentives have shifted, the outward appearance of stability becomes a deceptive veil. The modern economy is living inside the same structural dynamics that toppled previous hegemonies. The transition is not dramatic, not heralded, and not preventable once the stages have advanced sufficiently. Confidence persists. Institutions operate as if nothing has changed, and participants act rationally within the rules they know, even as the rules themselves are quietly shifting. The dollar did not collapse. It is being slowly replaced, just as history has shown will always happen. In the final stages of a dominant system, stability feels most convincing. Late-stage institutions appear unshakable, crises are normalized, and risk itself becomes a routine part of operations. Warnings are treated as noise, even by those who understand the underlying dynamics, because the cost of acknowledging them is immediate and tangible, while the consequences of inaction remain abstract and distant. Decision-makers focus on managing perception rather than fundamentals, reinforcing the illusion that control persists. Narrative control is central. Public communications, policy framing, and media amplification create the sense that all is well. Complex instruments, regulatory reassurances, and official statistics are invoked to maintain confidence. Meanwhile, the system continues its quiet erosion. Incentives that once aligned effort and reward are now inverted. Prudence is discouraged, leverage is celebrated. Dependence on the center persists, but the foundation of trust supporting it has already shifted elsewhere. This stage is also a period of rapid acceleration, though not in the way most imagine. The system does not fail overnight. It unravels with sudden clarity only after years of imperceptible transfers and structural weakening. By the time the cumulative effects of substitution, debt, and misaligned incentives are visible, the opportunity for corrective action has passed. Markets, contracts, and reserves have already responded to realities invisible to the casual observer. The apparent calm of the late stage is deceptive. It signals not stability, but the final coherence of a system in the process of being replaced. Incentives drive every aspect of this acceleration. Institutions act according to the rules encoded within them, not the intentions of their managers. Confidence persists because it remains rational to act as if the system is intact, even while structural signals point in the opposite direction. History has shown this phase before. Rome's final centuries, the late British Empire, early 21st century dollar hegemony. In every case, the last calm is also the first indication of irreversible change, and the transition concludes quietly, almost administratively, rather than catastrophically. History does not repeat because people are reckless or naive. It repeats because the structures they create carry incentives that persist far beyond any individual or administration. Civilizations, empires, and monetary systems are not conscious actors. They are networks of obligations, trust, and expectation. When these networks are stretched, distorted, or misaligned, the outcomes follow patterns embedded in the very mechanics of the system. Collapse, or replacement, is not a moral judgment nor a surprise. It is the inevitable consequence of predictable forces acting over time. Cycles of dominance, overextension, and substitution are neither random nor purely economic. They reflect human behavior interacting with incentive structures, the tendency to defer costs, to reward short-term gain over long-term stability, to normalize risk when the alternative is politically or financially inconvenient. The repetition is cold, structural, and indifferent to intention. Systems endure beyond their logic, persist beyond their capacity, and ultimately yield to alternatives that, quietly and incrementally, prove more reliable. As we observe these patterns today, it is tempting to look for crises, dramatic turning points, or sudden collapses. Yet the lesson from history is subtler, more profound, and quieter. The dollar, the dominant system of our era, is not collapsing in the popular sense. It is being gradually replaced through mechanisms that are almost imperceptible. Diversification of reserves, alternative settlement systems, incremental adoption of new units of account. The transition occurs transaction by transaction, reserve by reserve, contract by contract, until the shift is complete. Those living inside the system rarely perceive the change, until its consequences are undeniable. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.